Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Cuba's president is in Paris, the first time in more than 2 decades. We're talking about it in the company of Thomas WIBAUX of public affairs consultancy Avila Strategies. He's in the Washington suburb of Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Colin Harding from Manchester, Director of Policy Consultants, Latin Forum. And for part 2 of our discussions, we're pleased to welcome Laurent Muller, President of the Association, the European Association. Is it
for a free Cuba?
For a free Cuba.
For a free Cuba, yes.
For a free Cuba. Thank you for being with us. The last time a Cuban president was in Paris, another Castro, another François were in power. The year was 1995. Fidel Castro met François Mitterrand for what was not a state visit as such. When you look at those images, Laurent Muller, what's your feeling about the way Cuba's going today? How much has time changed?
It's very interesting because by the time Fidel Castro came to Paris, it was the time I was coming back from Cuba, where I had been only once, and then after I started the organization, the European Association for a Free Cuba, and I couldn't go back to Cuba. And I was very shocked by that time between the difference between the way the French press and the French tourism industry was speaking about Cuba, the way Fidel Castro was welcome, and the reality in the island, the reality of its history, and the reality of its social position and the social life of the Cubans. Daily life made of repression, of privation, and an history totally reinvented by Fidel Castro.
And would you say 2 decades on that the genie's out of the bottle, that Cuba's going to change for good now?
No, I'm not going to say it because I have no clue. For me, Cuba, the Cuban situation, the political Cuban situation has always been a mystery. I always wondered how the Cubans accepted that situation. We have part of the answer, terror on one side, and the geographic position of Cuba as an island on the other side. It's still a mystery to know to understand how people can be so badly treated by its politicians.
Reactions coming in, this one on Facebook from James. Hopefully, Hollande will encourage Cuba to free dissidents and respect human rights. In part 1 of our discussion, Colin Harding saying that, of course, behind closed doors, we don't know what's being said. What are your thoughts when you hear the French president call for the lifting of those remaining U.S. sanctions?
You know, 10 years ago, Mr. Hollande and Mr. Fabius wrote some very, very aggressive papers against the Cuban regime, and were very surprised because they were almost in contradiction with the rest of the French left. 10 years later, they are the one at the front position to open the doors to the Cuban regime. Between these dates, nothing has really changed in Cuba. I mean, human rights still are violated on a daily basis, on a constitutional basis. The freedom of information is still very limited. Freedom of reunion also. All these fundamental freedoms are still violated. Nothing has really changed in Cuba in 10 years.
Nothing's really changed in Cuba. Thomas WIBAUX, do you agree?
Well, I mean, while certainly the human rights concerns and the political concerns remain, I think that it would be deceptive to suggest that nothing's changed in Cuba in 10 years. For one, you now have 500,000 private entrepreneurs, and these are people who, yes, are licensed by the Cuban government, but who operate independently, pay their taxes, and now are less dependent on the Cuban government. They're an important part of Cuba's economy, and it's a growing part of Cuba's economy. Cuba has authorized and deployed 30 Wi-Fi hotspots throughout the country. Millions of Cubans have now access to cell phones, to albeit limited, slow, expensive, and censored internet, but certainly greater access than they had before. They're now allowed to visit hotels, which they weren't able to do before, to sell their homes, to purchase cars. There's a number of things that have changed. And of course, none of those, that's not enough. And a lot more needs to change in Cuba, especially if Cuba wants to meet its own economic goals that it set for itself. It just revised downward its GDP growth for the coming year. And with the U.S. presidential election in full swing, I think that it would behoove the Cuban government to take advantage of the spaces created by the executive orders issued by President Obama to try to expand its economy and meet the goals that they've established for themselves.
And on the point that Laurent Muller just made, Thomas, do you agree that it's impossible to tell whether or not, when it comes to civic freedoms, that whether or not the genie's out of the bottle?
Yeah, certainly it's very, very difficult. It's, any type of closed system that doesn't have the type of transparency we're used to, perhaps in France, the United States, is very difficult to know. There are rumors with the upcoming Communist Party Congress in April that there may be the introduction of a new election law, perhaps a new law of associations. So we're eagerly awaiting those potential reforms to see the details and see whether or not it opens more spaces for Cubans to participate in in their own government and to be able to constitute associations and advocate for issues that are important to them, from environmental issues to hopefully human rights issues as well.
Laurent Muller, do you agree with François Hollande, the French president, when he says it's time to lift the remaining sanctions?
I think it's time because it hasn't worked so far. Now, what kind of policy to be followed? I think a gigantic effort has to be done with the opposition to build a real democracy on a short or medium-term basis. Otherwise, we've seen what was going on in other countries. It's going to be a mafia country. I think it's going to be the evolution. It's going to be there's going to be an evolution, but it will remain a strength system.
Saying that sanctions don't work, certainly the mantra of the outgoing president of the United States. Roll back the clock to April of last year. Raul Castro and Barack Obama shaking hands at the Summit of the Americas, a détente that Obama revisited last month in his State of the Union address.
50 years of isolating Cuba had failed to promote democracy. It set us back in Latin America. That's why we restored diplomatic relations, opened the door to travel and commerce, positioned ourselves to improve the lives of the Cuban people.
Of course, Colin Harding, we didn't hear everyone cheer in the U.S. Congress there, and you were telling us in part one how the Republicans are going to try to stop this as much as possible. Although I say the Republicans, it doesn't really fall along party lines in the U.S. Who is for and who's against lifting those sanctions.
No, some of them are. Marco Rubio, notably, he's a Cuban-American. In fact, Ted Cruz as well. They're both, I think, very much against easing things off with Cuba, although a lot of second-generation, third-generation Cuban-Americans are much less militant about relations with Cuba than their parents and grandparents who, the old people who emigrated from Cuba, the anti-Castro people, who are keen to keep the sanctions in place, to keep pressure on Cuba to democratize, to open up and so on. But the younger people are far less ideological, I think. And so the politicians are aware of this, of course, and there is room for a bit of flexibility there, I suspect. But if a Republican's in the White House, it is going to be much more difficult because the Congress is dominated by the Republicans at the moment, and the lifting of the embargo, which Obama would like to do, is in Congress's hands, not the president. The president can do executive orders and change certain things, and he has been, as we've heard, but he can't lift he can't remove the remaining sanctions. That can only be done by Congress, and that's a much more problematic situation.
Much more problematic. Colin, let me go back to something that was said by Melissa Bell at the French presidential palace in part one of our discussion, how France understands just how much Cuba can be a spearhead for the rest of the region. We saw it most recently as Havana is the place where they're negotiating perhaps a historic peace deal between Colombia's government and the Farc rebels. Just how much clout does Cuba have today when we're seeing for the first time in a long while the left lose elections in Latin America, in places like Argentina, Venezuela, and others?
Well, yes, there was a feeling a few years ago there was a sort of left-wing tide sweeping over Latin America, and that was the way history was moving. But I think it's rather less clear that that's the case now. You know, Argentina and Venezuela are the two clearest examples, the only unequivocally pro-Cuban regimes now in Latin America are really rather minor ones like Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. But I think the whole issue of Cuba and the blockade against Cuba has been an irritant, as Obama himself said in that clip, that the rest of Latin America have no patience with this policy at all. Even right-wing or conservative regimes like Colombia or Peru and Mexico, they think this is a thing of the past. It hasn't worked. It gets in the way, and Cuba ought to be allowed back into the international community. And so I think they all feel, whether they're pro-Castro or not, that they do want this out of the way.
Well, let me put this to Thomas Bilbao. Thomas, with the fortunes of the left waning in countries like Venezuela and Argentina, does that lessen the clout of Cuba?
Well, I don't think that necessarily Cuba's clout depends on the success or not of the leftist regimes in the region, but certainly has an important effect on Cuba's economy. Venezuela being Cuba's main trade partner, important supplier of energy to Cuba. I think that as oil prices continue to fall and Venezuela's economy is all but in ruins, it'll be important for Cuba to diversify its trade partners. I think Raul Castro understands this better than most after his experience with the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think that that's why it's important to find trade partners in Europe and elsewhere and diversify Cuba's trade portfolio in order to lessen the risks. I also want to make two clarifying points.
So are you saying that in effect those low oil prices are a historic opportunity when it comes to getting Cuba to change its friends and allies?
Well, first of all, I don't think that we can force Cuba to do anything, but I do think that Cuban leaders will understand that it's important to diversify their trading partners, and that creates opportunities for other countries. Certainly, those who have had a relationship with Cuba in the past, Cuba's tourism minister, in an effort to assuage the fears of European businessmen, recently said that Cuba will continue to give priorities to those countries or those investors who were with Cuba during the blockade, during the embargo and before this opening between the United States and Cuba. And so I think that there's an opportunity here, not just for American firms given the opening, but certainly for European firms, especially those who already have a relationship inside Cuba.
Laurent Muller, on this point.
On this point, I believe that Cuba is playing its survival. The Cuban regime is playing its survival. It already tried to move toward Europe 15 years ago.
Remember, because let's talk about this.
Yes.
Remember when the Berlin Wall fell?
Yes.
People said, oh, that's going to be it for the Castro regime. It wasn't. It was
Okay.
1989.
Who did Cuba turn? To Europe. And a lot of people opened the door. That's when the Pope went to Cuba a couple of years after, and the relationship had been already developed between European countries and Cuba. And then after a while, Chavez came to power and started helping and promoting the Cuban Revolution everywhere because it was its natural ally. And then Venezuela is disappearing as an ally. So it has to change and to expand its partners, and it comes back to Europe. I think that's exactly what we're watching now with the Cuban regime. It's playing its survival on the short term. The economic situation is terrible. Now you have a new wave of tourism, which is helping, and you have new sources of financing that are found through this kind of negotiation like the one we had today in Paris, and it's going to help the regime to survive. The problem with Cuba is the more you give this regime, the tougher it feels, and the tougher it feels, the harder it is with its opponents.
Thomas Bilbao,
of a vicious circle.
Thomas Bilbao, do you agree that signing major deals between the likes of France and Cuba only strengthens the regime?
Well, I mean, it depends on the deals, and certainly I think that any effort that helps break the isolation of the Cuban people, that extends economic opportunities to the Cuban people, opens the door for greater information, greater contact with the outside world is positive, and that's why President Obama has taken the unilateral steps under executive authority to do so. But not every business deal is going to be the same, and I think it would be a mistake to group them all into one bucket.
And do you
I could give you an example. For Airbnb closed a deal or announced last year that they were now allowing American travelers to Cuba to book rooms in private homes of Cubans who were authorized to rent out rooms. This is a transaction that connects directly the demand of the United States to private entrepreneurs in Cuba, and those resources go to support private enterprise inside Cuba. And so certainly that's a very positive example. And even big U.S. firms that want to have a presence in Cuba, if they look to do so responsibly, can have a very positive impact on the Cuban people.
Laurent Muller, Airbnb is the vanguard of the revolution.
It's a good symbol. The Cuban regime is going to try to manage as much as it can the control over its population. It's going to allow some changes, but will remain in control. The point is, the most important thing is to know how it will evolve toward democracy. And that's the big question. And for me, the only answer is by helping its opposition and by helping creating a democratic society.
Colin Harding, what's your thoughts on that Airbnb example that Thomas Bilbao just gave?
Well, interesting. I hadn't heard about that one, but yes, of course, there are lots of examples of private enterprise being permitted in Cuba, but of course there's no guarantee that economic development, increasing prosperity, more private enterprise will lead to a political opening, as has already been said, to any loosening of the party control. As we've seen in China, of course, the Communist Party in China has got no intention at all of allowing political democracy or any kind of political competition. And if the Cubans are going to try and keep, the Cuban Communist Party is going to try and keep control as long as it possibly can. Of course, Raul Castro has also to bear in mind there are factions within the party, within the apparatus, and he has to try and manage them. For instance, the self-employed sector, in things like restaurants and small businesses which are run by individuals or families, the number had been increasing, but recently it's actually started going down again. I think and Fidel allowed some private business at one time, and then it took fright and rode back on that. And there's a slight indication at the moment that something like that might be happening again. They don't want to let things go too far because it might get out of political control. So the process is not necessarily all in one direction, I think.
Thomas Bilbao, Raul Castro is 84 years old. What happens after his day?
Well, Cuba has already proven that they can manage a process of transition from one leader to the other. Up until now, both have been from the same family, same last name. So it'll be interesting to see how the process takes place. In February of 2018, when Raul Castro has said he will end his term as president, and then we would expect that the first vice president will take over. So it will be important because it's going to be a transition in generations to a generation of new leaders from the folks who were responsible for bringing about the revolution in '59. So,
but if the new president of
Congress,
Cuba no longer has the Castro brand, what happens then?
Well, so that is specifically what the government has in fact said publicly they're concerned about, which is this transition to a new generation of leaders. And so I think it's important to see what happens in the party Congress in April, see maybe perhaps new faces in the Central Committee of the party, new faces in the Council of Ministers. And this will serve as a way to begin to position this new generation of folks expected to take over and to help them gain the experience and legitimacy perhaps that they'll need in order to maintain power. But certainly it'll be very difficult to have a transition to someone that doesn't have the like you said, legitimacy or cachet of having the last name Castro, but certainly I don't think that in and in itself means that the transition from Raul Castro to a successor won't necessarily be a smooth one.
Laurent Muller?
Yeah, I think exactly the same. We don't know what will happen with this issue of legitimacy. We don't know who will come out of the next Communist Congress. We don't know who are the people behind the scene, the one who have the real power as of today, because it's we see the old guard. We see someone like Ramiro Valdez, who is still the head of the Ministry of Interior. We still see the Castro brothers. We still see a couple of people who are over 80 now, and it's going to change with the next generation. Will it happen? And I'm likely to think so. The next generation coming back toward the first world. When speaking about Cuba, we should never forget that, contrarily to the revolutionary myth, Cuba wasn't an underdeveloped country in 1959. It was a country with big inequalities, but it was the way Cubans were living, the rate of literacy, the number of doctors, and so on. It was much closer to the first world than to the third world.
All right, supporters of Castro will disagree, but let me ask you one last question, Laurent Muller, which is, in France, this fascination with Cuba, it's really a throwback to another era. Melissa Bell was telling us there's the widow of a former head of the Communist Party who's at the dinner tonight, and in France, people really either love or hate the Cuban government. Why are the French so passionate about Cuba?
I think because we have a very weird relationship with communism. We are one of the last countries in the world where we still have a communist party. We had almost 30% of the voters in 1946 who voted for the Communist Party. It was more than anywhere else in the world. And the communists has still remained close to the power, have been infiltrating all the administration and the French culture. That's why 50 years, 60 years, 70 years after the Second World War, 50 years after the death of, 60 years after the death of Stalin, we still have people who name themselves communists. And I think it goes in that direction, to have the widow of the ex-leader of the Communist Party who is present today at the Élysée Palace.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Laurent Muller, I want to thank you. I want to thank Thomas Bilbao in Alexandria, Virginia, Colin Harding in Manchester. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next.